Welcome to the wonderful fantasy world. Subscribe now. The Mark of the Two Snakes, The Rebirth of the God, Slayer. Volume 1, The Awakening of the Blood Oath. Chapter 11, The Gear Roadmark. The night wind in the misty wasteland, carrying sand and gravel, made the rusty gear Roadmark creak. As soon as Aiden's fingertips touched the mottled metal surface, the red snake's spiritual light, like a living thing, burrowed into the gear cracks. Where the rust peeled off, a snake-shaped notch was revealed, faintly resonating with the double snake mark on his chest. This was the 7th abandoned post they had encountered in 3 days. Each road mark pointed in a different direction, yet in Aiden's blood, red eyes, the same gear cracks emerged. Another dead end! Ironwing from the hawk-headed tribe swiped his steel claws across the gear surface, and the sparks that splashed flickered in the mist. Since signing the Misty Wasteland Agreement in Chapter 10, the caravan had been following the pointer of his father's pocket, watch westward, only to keep getting lost in this maze composed of gear debris. Aiden stared at the arrow on the road mark that suddenly turned northwest. The newly emerged ancient words, Silver Snake Outpost, were heating up in the spiritual light. It was the code name of the church's spiritual vein furnace in Chapter 14 of the Prequel. Wait! Aiden held down Ironwing's steel claws that were about to strike the road mark. The direction of the gear cracks in his blood, red eyes, was completely consistent with the frequency of the gears in the pocket watch. When the red snake's spiritual light was injected into the double snake groove at the bottom of the road mark, all the gears of the entire post suddenly started to turn in reverse, revealing a hidden underground passage. The stone walls were engraved with the sacrifice symbols of the previous Divine Throne experiment, exactly the same as the base of the Divine Throne in the church's secret chamber in Chapter 3. A low murmur of gear friction came from the depths of the passage. Aiden's snake-shaped wrench suddenly became hot, and the blurred double snake pattern on the handle coincided with the Loren emblem on the stone wall. In the cold light of the flashlight, he saw that the gears on both sides of the passage were engraved with the names of aliens, exactly the snake tribe warriors petrified by the siphon cannon in the blood fire siege in Chapter 4. These gears are recording pain. Raw snake tail swept across the gear engraved with Syrah, the name of her childhood playmate. When the iron gate of the underground furnace burst open, Aiden was forced to take a half step back by the oncoming silver snake-shaped flames. 20 gear prisons were suspended in the air, and in each prison, an alien whose spiritual veins were being extracted was imprisoned. Blood, colored patterns identical to the church's spell, imprints emerged on their skin, the spiritual vein imprisonment chains designed by Loren in Chapter 3 of the Prequel. They're refining the residual energy of the Eternal Silence Core. Lily's voice trembled. The gear compass in her hand was pointing at the giant gear in the center. Aiden's blood, red eyes swept over the prison numbers. The engravings from Eternal Silence 47 to Eternal Silence 62 reminded him of the self-destruction spell imprint on Old Tom's wrist in Chapter 2. When he tried to use the spiritual light to cut off the spiritual vein siphon chain, Loren's mechanical laughter suddenly boomed in the space. Anger is the best fuel for the Divine Throne, God, Slayer. Are you ready to burn? An energy flow diagram of the previous Divine Throne experiment emerged on the gear surface, forming a strange resonance with the mark on his chest. Don't move? Mara suddenly coiled around Aiden's waist and dragged him into the shadow of the gear. 12 silver snake-shaped beams passed by the tip of his hair, melting warning symbols of the previous Divine Throne experiment on the stone wall. Aiden then noticed that the gear core in the center of the furnace was devouring the alien spiritual vein crystals, and the silver snake form of the flames was exactly the same as the siphon cannon during the church's raid in Chapter 4 of the Prequel. Look up! Lily pointed at the base of the gear core, where a half piece of parchment was scattered. In the center of the double snake entwining pattern on the edge, the words, "The Dithrone needs the anger of the blood of the two snakes to start," had been covered by spiritual vein burn marks. Aiden recognized that this was the same ink as the number "5" on the broken gear in the gallows square in Chapter 3. His father's diary had mentioned this key parameter of the previous Divine Throne experiment. The moment he picked up the remaining pages of the log, His blood-red eyes suddenly penetrated time and space. The young Loren was Tialpeiing the spiritual vein solution in the laboratory. A fragment of Vera's snake-headed sword accidentally fell into the gears, and the splashed blood droplets drew a double snake track on the metal surface. The broken piece of the weapon from the confrontation of the two snakes in Chapter 5 of the prequel. Anger makes the gears turn, but it also makes them crack. The voice of the remnant soul Vera sounded in his mind, overlapping with the image of his mother being burned in his memory. Aiden suddenly woke up and found that his red snake spiritual light was eroding the gear core uncontrollably. The spiritual fireball of the caravan youth suddenly smashed into the monitor. Amid the alarm sound, he saw that the snake-shaped birthmark on the youth's back was exactly the same as the destroyed Snake Tribe totem in Chapter 4 of the prequel. "They're collecting your emotions," Lily shouted and threw a gear bomb. Just like Loren used despair to drive the Eternal Silence core in Chapter 6 of the prequel. The blast wave blew off the protective plate of the gear core. Aiden finally saw the internal structure. 3 gear grooves were engraved with anger, sorrow, and hope, respectively. Exactly the activation conditions of the Divine Throne mentioned in the raid plan in the Gear Black Market in Chapter 5. When he pressed his palm on the Hope groove, the red snake spiritual light suddenly resonated with the remaining spiritual veins of Vera in the gear, presenting a complete picture of the spiritual vein ceremony in Chapter 2 of the prequel. Aliens and humans drank the spiritual veins together, and the pottery cup glowed with a blood-colored light under the bonfire. "So they've been waiting for me." Aiden looked at the relit coordinates of the Silver Snake Outpost and finally understood why the Church had allowed them to penetrate deep into the wasteland. The core of the Divine Throne needed the emotional energy of the blood of the two snakes, and anger was the purest fuel. He tightly grasped the remaining pages of the log and found his father's handwriting on the back. Loren's mechanical heart is in the gear maze of the Divine Palace. Use your blood, red eyes, to look at its cracks. The gears at the top of the furnace suddenly reversed, directing the energy of the spiritual vein siphon chain towards the self-destruction program. Aiden took the opportunity to smash the anger groove with his wrench. The Loren emblem on the gear surface shattered, revealing the snake-shaped relief of Vera inside. "Take the aliens away." He stuffed the pocket watch into Mara's hand. The pointer was pointing at the time space turbulence area in the northwest. "I'll go confirm the coordinates of the Silver Snake Outpost." When Aiden walked alone into the gear tunnel, the murals of the previous era on the wall suddenly lit up. Loren and Vera were standing hand in hand in front of the Divine Throne. The gear crown and the snake-scale armor were both glowing. The inscription below read, "When the two snakes become one, the gears will stop." This was a scene that had never appeared in the elegy of the Godslayer in Chapter 8 of the prequel. The fragments of his mother's snake-scale armor were exactly the same as Vera's wrist guard in the mural. The iron gate of the Silver Snake Outpost at the end of the tunnel burst open. What greeted him was not the church soldiers, but the ground full of gear debris engraved with the WL numbers. Aiden picked up one of them and found that the star map of the previous Divine Throne experiment was engraved on the inner side. The gear disassembly diagram in his father's diary was rotating in the center of the star map. The 3 weakness markers corresponded to Loren's mechanical heart, Vera's spiritual vein crystal, and the church's lies. "They want me to become the new Eternal Silence Core," Aiden whispered into the communicator. The spiritual vein fluctuations of the caravan suddenly took on the shape of 2 snakes in his blood-red eyes. When he turned around, he found that the gears at the entrance of the tunnel were closing, and the closing frequency was exactly the same as his heartbeat, the gear sound in his father's blacksmith shop in Chapter 13 of the prequel, and also the precursor to the activation of the core of the Divine Throne. The moment the last gear was about to close, Aiden inserted the snake-headed sword into the ground. The red snake's spiritual light spread like a spider web, forcefully holding up the metal door weighing several tons. He saw Mara waving at him in the distance. The blood pattern at the bottom of the pottery cup and his mark were shining alternately in the mist, a symbol of the Misty Wasteland Agreement and proof that he refused to be fuel. Anger is a tool, not a shackle. Aiden stared at the crack in the gear core, from which the unique blood-colored spiritual veins of Vera were seeping. He suddenly understood that the church was not hunting the aliens but was afraid of losing control of fear. When people no longer feared the gears stopping, the lies of the Divine Throne would collapse on their own. The alarm of the Silver Snake Outpost suddenly rang, In the Homyushung of the collapsing gears, Aiden saw that the monitor screen showed 3 approaching energy reactions: the Church's gear fleet, the alien spiritual veinstorm, and an unknown fluctuation from the direction of the Stargate. He touched the jade pendant on his chest, and for the first time, the voice of the remnant soul Vera carried a smile. It seems that your gear roadmark has never pointed to the end. When Aiden stepped out of the outpost, the mist was dispersing, revealing the outline of the petrified ancient tree in the distance. He knew that those gears regarded as waste products by the Church would eventually start turning again at some point, not as shackles but as roadmarks, pointing in the direction that every life can decide for itself. At this moment, the remaining pages of the log in his hand were glowing. It was Loren's warning, his father's expectation, and the true weight of the mark of the 2 snakes. Not inheriting a curse, but the courage to make a choice. The bonfire of the caravan was flickering in the distance. As Aiden walked towards his companions, the sole of his boot crushed a gear engraved with Vera. Rust, mixed with spiritual vein liquid, seeped out of the ground, drawing a pattern of 2 snakes entwining on the sand. The starting point of the previous Divine Throne experiment and the new coordinate of his journey. In the crack of the gear, a blood-colored seed was germinating. It was a plant that had never existed in the misty wasteland. Its roots were growing along the gear's pattern towards the direction of freedom. This episode ends here. The next episode will be more exciting. Subscribe now